Hello, everybody. I hope this moment finds you well, and I hope that this video contributes to that wellness getting even deeper. So, welcome. Just some housekeeping. I always forget to mention this. If you are interested in working with me one-on-one, email me, and we'll set up a kind of a consultation to explore if that's a fit or not. If you are interested in dialectic into dialogos, the practice of philosophical intimacy and dialogue that I teach with John and Christopher, there's one coming up here pretty soon. The link for that's below. And if you're interested in circling, we have drop-in weekly events at the Circling Institute, and we have weekend intensives and year-long programs. All of that's below in the show notes. Sweet. So we're at the part of the book in Pearl Beyond Price where Almaas is starting to get into like basically case studies, right? As he is trying to elucidate this notion of what is ultimately underneath being a person, being a self, right? And that he's basically claiming, right? I don't know, claim it is the right word, but realizing, pointing to the ground of personalness, right? Not being at like, or having an ego, not being a schism, right, with something ultimate, but that somehow they're deeply, 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 deeply united, non-schematized, if you will. And one of the things you're going to notice as we go into his work with his with his students, you're going to be seeing this thing happen over and over and over again, where a certain kind of suffering is going to be described that the person's going through, and the encouragement is this particular way of paying attention to that suffering, right? And it's usually described as a kind of allowing attention towards it and to it, a kind of profound or welcoming witnessing, which right directly on the way the person's suffering. Now, this is not a witnessing that's like a detached looking at an object. It's a witnessing of participation, of deep investment that's synonymous with the understanding. So the witnessing, right, is synonymous with the participatory understanding of what that suffering is ultimately about, and letting it unfold. And what you'll notice is that in different ways with different people with different issues, right, that there's some kind of eye of the needle in a, you could use that phrase, that one goes through, that if one can stick with it, right, be a dedicated witness, participatory witness towards what is most straining and constraining and most suffering inducing, that there's a process of unfoldment that can start to happen that often leads to something deeper, that is a kind of, you could say, an emptiness, a phenomenological fullness, a fulfillment on a kind of implicit promise that in some sense makes the turning towards one's suffering worth it, if you will, right? And I think that this is striking, right? This and when that kind of being unfolds, it starts to unravel these kind of like compensatory structures or psychological structures, that these structures oftentimes are these attempts to mimic the qualities, right, that you're disconnected from, the essential qualities of being, like the qualities of strength, the qualities of love, the qualities of will, the platonic forms of these things, that when we when we are cut off from those, our psychology starts to try to mimic those structures, right, by a kind of self-catabolism, right, in some sense, that only brings temporary relief and is fundamentally inauthentic because its basis is on the loss of contact with what it's trying to mimic. Therefore, the act of mimicking is already presupposes the loss. So it's a furthering away from that. So this awareness, this allowing attention affords one to kind of work backwards, right, into the very source of the loss. And that there's usually this kind of hell that one needs to kind of allow and go through, that when one dips back down, there's this emerging of this dynamism that kind of can come up into these structures and dissolve them, right? And I think there's something so striking about that, right? This, and this is by no means originated in Almaas, right? This sense of like this capacity that awareness innately has, where it could become aware of, participate in, voluntarily move towards the thing that's most painful, and have an allowing participatory relationship with that, even when it doesn't see any light at the end of the tunnel. There's something so extraordinary about that. It's kind of like, in some sense, there's this thing I've been kind of reading this Christian theologian, Gregory of is it Nyssa, Thesa, Gregory, Saint Gregory. He's an Eastern Universalist, one of the more profound theologians ever, right? And he has this kind of notion of this understanding of time, right? That the end is actually the beginning, right? And that the beginning, right, has an intimations of the end, right? So in some sense, there's this sense that the reality that we're in is actually a foreshadowing of the realization that has yet to happen yet of the perfection of God, if you will, right? But when one realizes that perfection, right, they stand in some sense harkens to the beginning. But that end, right, was in the very beginning that harkens one toward that which it's foreshadowing. So the beginning is in the end, and the end is in the beginning. And you can see this pattern in this innate sense of turning towards the thing. Because if you think about that, if you can't see any hope in your suffering, by what means do you have any leverage to turn towards it? But we can, which tells me that in some sense, there's what is to be revealed in the emergence of being is already present in the germ of our awareness. There's something about awareness that implicitly harkens toward that end. And that this allowing, and it seems to be in this open-handedness, this turning towardness that is in some sense the end that affords this emerging of being and this resolution of things. This, you could say, the redeeming of the fall, but in Christian language. I'm not Christian, so I'm not that familiar with the language, but I think that's relatively accurate. All right, so that's one of the things that's strikes me about Almaas and has been striking me since I've been reading it again. So speaking of Almaas and speaking of reading, let's just pick up where we left off. Okay, so Sandy has been taking autonomy to mean engaging only in activities of her choice. But acting out this belief failed to give her autonomy, which she warned and felt she lacked. the actions or reactions that she thought would give her freedom and personal autonomy served only to temporarily cover up this sense of lack. So there we can see that the act of trying to resolve is the act of unresolving. He goes on, her work in this session allowed her to see the futility of her habitual attempts to cover up the lack of autonomy. And by allowing herself to feel the lack instead of running away from it, so this turning toward, right, this willingness to feel, she was able to see more clearly that it was she really wanted the sense of being herself, which she thought autonomy would bring. Okay, so there's the participatory understanding that she's coming to by turning towards it. He goes on, where was I? She was able to see more clearly what it was she really wanted, the sense of being herself, which she thought autonomy would bring. This understanding participated the sought-after state of autonomy, which turned out to be simply the presence of who she is, the fullness of her personal essence, right? So in understanding the break being manifested as the seeking for autonomy in circumstances and situations, in understanding it, she walks herself back, sees the in some sense, understands that mechanism, and in understanding and allowing it and allowing all of the experiences of that, she taps into something that's more essential, more like I would imagine it's kind of the difference between a spring lake and a dammed lake, right? You get this sense of a spring-fed lake, which has a quality of there-ness from within itself, right? Whereas a dammed lake is kind of like a construction of, there's a lake, but if that it's not from within itself, it's there by virtue of contingencies outside of it. There's this contingent source, right? In some sense of the spring lake. Sounds pretty good, I thought. All right, you see guys compensation right there. This understanding participated in the sought-after state of autonomy, which turned out to be simply the presence of who she is, the fullness of her personal essence. Autonomy, it became clear, is simply the freedom to be. When there is personal presence of being, then there is autonomy. We should note here that an important factor in the ease with which she arrived at the experience of personal essence has to do with the fact that the teacher's state of being, which responds to her need, will support her by manifesting in the state she feels is lacking. We'll discuss this point later. So the teacher, I mean, in some sense, he's talking about a kind of mentorship or a modeling, right? But modeling from an intrinsic kind of spring lake, not a more like a method actor versus I don't know, memorizing your lines and forming a construction that looks like the thing that you're trying to convey. You're actually being the thing. So in some sense, this is a kind of genuine mentorship, right? That the teacher in the inquiry, right, holds a glow that the student has a felt sense of the missing, which in some sense serves as a horizon that affords the student, helps the student move towards the thing that's probably difficult. Almost goes on. However, as we have just seen in Sandy's initial attitudes, autonomy is rarely understood in terms of being. In Western culture, especially in the United States, independence and autonomy are generally understood to mean being able to do one's own thing, quote unquote. This means usually to be successful, to have made it, to be self-reliant, physically, psychologically, and socially, and most important, financially. In terms of development, autonomy means to be able to live independently from from one's parents, to support oneself financially, to not be dependent on anyone. These are clearly all signs of autonomy on the ego level of development, but hardly constitutes autonomy on the level of being. Right? So Almaas is talking about this thing that's often missing in the West, and there's a long history to this, right? Kind of, it in some sense it's really articulated in Augustine, right? That's taken over by Calvinism and Luther, and this sense whereas you could say in the unifying vision, the Neoplatonic roots, right, of Western Western tradition, right, has a sense in which all things, right, are heading towards, given by, and organized by the ultimate good, right? And what the good is called, right, in Christianity is God, in Plato it's the good, right? Plotinus, it's the one, right? And therefore autonomy, right, freedom in some sense is freedom for that which is most ultimate and universal, right? Well, through a long history, right, there's this sense where there's this kind of where autonomy, right, in some sense gets, I don't know if I'm doing any justice to this, so forgive me for this little rant, but autonomy in some sense becomes absolutely about the agent. Like, so where you start to get in this is very, very, it's in this idea is in the well water in America, right? This sense in which there's an absolute sovereignty that is completely the will willing itself for the sake of its own will willing itself, right? This sense that it's the highest good, because it's in some sense it's gets disconnected from the ultimate, this whole sense of God no longer being grounded in the good, right? But rather the primary thing with God is power, which gets disconnected and then comes into the power of the individual, right? And so in some sense, you could say the manifestation of the loss of contact with being, right, with the good, right, this universal sense of the word, manifests as kind of an understanding of what it is to be autonomous are these contingent factors, right? This being able to be independent from your parents, to support yourself financially, this whole, all of the stuff that's just like, well, of course that's autonomy. And in fact, if somebody can't do that, that's clearly like something's just kind of going on with them, that there's something's wrong. Or yet in that picture, there's nothing wrong with those things. But what he's saying is that there's another possibility that those things, right, could be not a mimicking of autonomy and freedom, but could be the expression of that. And that is probably very rarely experienced as such. All right, he goes on. Independence, autonomy, making it on one's own are strong ideals in the United States, but these qualities are also coveted in most human societies. Autonomy is one of the great hallmarks of a strong ego. The stronger the ego, the more independent is its individuality. Autonomy is considered a manifestation of mature human development. Objects relations theory sees autonomy as an expression of individuation. Of achieving a separate individuality and a sense of self. In fact, individuation is seen as the result of, or even equivalent to physical independence and autonomy. Mahler takes autonomy to be the aim of the separation individuation process, which arises in the second subphase, the practicing period, and becomes more of an intrapsychic reality in the fourth subphase of the process. Writing about this intrapsychic accomplishment of individuality, she states, quote, "We see a lot of active resistance to the demands of adults, a great need and a wish, often still unrealistic, for autonomy, independence. As we discussed in Chapter 2, the accomplishment of separation individuation is understood to be the acquiring of independence from the mothering person in the process of forming a stable self-image and sense of self. Its final outcome is indeed the achievement of individuality, the capacity to be a person in one's own right and to function autonomously. Thus, in terms of ego development, acquiring autonomy is the same as the achievement of the intrapsychic task of the separation individuation process. The attainment of identity, separateness, and individuality. We can see then that society's idealization of autonomy points to the deeper significance of the desire of the man of the world for autonomy. It means to him becoming, quote, his own person, unquote. It means individuation, growth and maturity, independence and autonomy within society, making it, achieving the capacities to support oneself and one's family, the ability to make free choices about one's life, are the adult's expression of individuation, signs of the maturity of his ego development, and the fruition of the solidification of his individuality. The findings of objects relations theory, however, show that these phenomena, which are taken by society to indicate autonomy, may only be skin deep. Okay, so here's the dialectic. Hang on one second. I have to plug in my computer. If I can find the cord. Just notice the lack of autonomy I have from my power cord. Okay, we go on. Findings of objects relations theory, however, show that these phenomena, which are taken by society to induce autonomy, may only be skin deep. These findings identified a more basic level of autonomy, that of emotional independence, as the core of actual autonomy. Thus, some individuals who may appear autonomous because they are successful, productive people may lack the intrapsychic achievement of independence and therefore lack a true inner core of autonomy. In these cases, it is well known, the individual lives of a life of emptiness and emotional desolation. This situation of apparent autonomy without real emotional support is regarded as characteristic of a certain character pathologies, especially those of the narcissistic personality and the borderline conditions, and sometimes even the schizoid character. These personalities have not accomplished the task of the separation individuation process, and thus the sense of self is not formed cohesively. It is fragile and vulnerable, dependent on external achievements and praise, and largely defensive. So he's talking about psychopathology, right, as a breakdown in these, Mahlerian individuation, like, what did he call that? Let's see. Separation and individuation process, basically. That something goes wrong in there, right? And then what should be found intrapsychically and emotionally, right, is basically not found there. And so the individual becomes high achieving, right? psychopathically at times, to try to realize this self-esteem, this autonomy through becoming, high achieving, running companies, being manic, all that kind of stuff. So on the outside, we can actually look at those people and glamorize them as, kind of thinking that it's true autonomy, right? But if we look deeper, oftentimes the thing that really drives that success, right, is this loss of contact with genuine autonomy. I think it's basically what he's saying. Okay, he goes on. Object relations theory might say that Sandy's conflict in our presentation above is a manifestation either of incomplete individuation or of some conflict about it. While this is a good general diagnosis, it fails to explain the final result in the work session. Sandy finally saw that autonomy means being who she is, experiencing a full, strong presence of being. She did not end up feeling an emotional sense of autonomy, nor did she gain a clear concept or image of herself. According to objects relations theory, Sandy will be autonomous when she finally has a separate individuality and a stable sense of self, which allow her to pursue and enjoy her endeavors with minimal frustration. Very psychoanalytic language. As we enjoy, I don't know, something about that struck me, which will allow her to pursue and enjoy her endeavors with minimal frustration. That's like a really beautiful vision of possibility, right? Enjoy your endeavors with minimal frustration, right? Defining, you can see this in psychology, in the guts of like psychoanalytic kind of psychologies, that there is this kind of depressing view where like you strike a deal with reality such that you form realistic images of the world such that you're not that disappointed or something like that. It's a kind of a depressing, and in some sense you could say it's depressing because it's disconnected from a more of an understanding of being, right? That there's a reality beyond just the psychology, right? What gives rise to psychology, right, is grounded in something beyond psychology. What is this beyond psychology, right? And when you don't have that, you kind of have these philosophies and these epistemologies and these psychologies that understand themselves, where you have to kind of make these deals with how sucky it is in some sense, because you've lost the good, right, in a deep way. And I would have to say, as I'm talking about this, by the way, we all, if you're listening to this video, most likely you drink the same well water I do. These kinds of ideas and this loss, this disconnection from being, what we call modernity, right, is a fucking tragedy in some deep way, right? Or has at least a tragic element, because there's nihilism is in the groundwater, right? It's not something. I agree with Heidegger on this. Like, nihilism isn't something you are or aren't. Nihilism is baked in, right, to your understanding of being, that you come to find yourself having by the time you're conscious of having a first name and a second name. You're already incarnating into these ideas, right, that are, split off from a kind of a something generative, non-contingent, right? Something like being, the good, those kinds of things. So anyways, as he goes on, as we have seen, this would involve her establishing a well-rounded, secure self-image, and also objects constancy. There's our favorite word, objects constancy. While we agree that these developments may give her a sense of emotional autonomy, we note that the final outcome in the session involves a far deeper level of autonomy than that dealt with by objects relations theory. In fact, it raises the question of whether ego autonomy is autonomy at all. And I think what he's saying here, right, is he's saying that, what is he saying? That objects relations, okay, so because it doesn't have this sense of what's beyond the ego, right, it only sees within terms of images, right? And so when there's a fragment in that image, the idea is that through the therapy, right, that you start to update, right, these images where it's more realistic, it's more whole, it's less pathological, right? It's more connected. And that it's through that image of yourself that you restore yourself to sanity or depathologize it, becomes more realistic and stuff like that. But what he's pointing out is that this didn't happen for Sandy, right? She didn't talk about like seeing herself exactly differently, but it was more of an intrinsic experiential connection to her ontological facticity, right? That there's that she is at all, that she's there, that there is a presence, and this presence had intrinsic to it, unseparated from it, revealed a sense of autonomy, right? So, and he's saying that wasn't had to do with it with constructing or deconstructing or updating images, but there was a presence that the image of herself, right, could like didn't include, let's say. Okay, I'll read one more paragraph and we'll call this video complete. Here we return to our dialogue between the man of the world and the man of the spirit. In developmental psychology, emotional independence and ego autonomy are seen as the culmination of ego development. While this perspective explains one of the deepest aspirations of the man of the world, the desire for autonomy, it does not take into consideration the values of the man of spirit and the deepest insights of man's most profound teaching. Objects relations theory, at least as it is understood in the United States, does not take being into consideration, but rather takes the self-image as the core of human realization. And as we saw in chapter 2, from the perspective of the man of spirit, the self-image is not real. It is only a conceptual construct. Thus, the accomplishment of the task of separation individuation, however necessary, cannot be the acme of human realization, since it is based on an illusory identification. Of course, in objects relations theory, much more than establishing the self-image is involved in ego development. It involves an integration of the various developmental achievements and the various so-called ego functions, such as perception, memory, thinking, synthesis, defense, and so on. But the basic accomplishment is experiencing oneself as a separate individual based on a self-image composed of memories. From the perspective of the man of the spirit, however, one is actually a being independent from mind, existing outside the field of memory. From this perspective, the accomplishment of ego autonomy is ultimately a prison. In identifying with the self-image constructed through the process of ego development, we cage ourselves. How can this be autonomy, this bondage, which is the primary source of human suffering? Okay, now we're getting into these, you're kind of getting into these conflicts, right? So let's keep going. The drama ensues. Only when the developmental psychology takes into consideration the fact that the nature of man is being will a true understanding of autonomy emerge. Okay, there's the synthesis. Again, we note that we note that its perspective is not incorrect, only limited. A similar limitation is seen sometimes on the side of the man of spirit. Some people actually seek out the impersonal levels of being in order to avoid dealing with the issues of autonomy, otherwise known as, what do they call that? What's the popular term for that? Spiritual bypassing, I think is what it's called. Being in order to avoid dealing with the issues of autonomy, which must be faced in ordinary ego development, as well as in the development of the personal essence. Okay, so basically, he's in this way in the issues with autonomy, right? He's almost is revealing the conflicts both between the man of the spirit, right, and the man of the world, but also the conflicts within each other. That what he's proposing is that they're both true and they're not connected to one another, which results in the synthesis that is lacking between those things that I think Almaas feels he's making here. Because he's saying that autonomy, right, the individual autonomy is the connection with being. You don't get rid of autonomy in order to be connected to being, like the man of spirit, right? And you don't become autonomous through just acquiring more memory-based pictures of yourself that become more accurate or something, right? That both of those point to a deep truth, but are incomplete in some sense, right? But that the presence, right? So in other words, there may be mental pictures, there may be memories. However, those things probably will become a expression, right? Something that would be an expression of something essential that isn't having to do with memory, but yet still provides a sense of personalness. But that personalness is grounded, I would say, in an ontological reality. Thus, the restoration to the good, if you want to use Platonic language here. All right. Thank you so much. I'll see you next time. Oh,